quickly get into the discussion. And Sanjeev, I would like to start with you. You made some very interesting remarks on how the whole idea of chaos and complexity and so on and so forth. But I would like to just take a step back and try to understand from you, as you talk about cities, and you talked about Singapore and Chandigarh and so on and so forth. The question is that how can we learn from Singapore? Because Singapore did so many powerful things. Can we actually replicate a city like Singapore in India? Because we have many cities which are at a stage of growth. That was what Singapore was like in about 1970s or 80s. So we could actually do that. How do we actually get to that?
So one important thing is to stop thinking about replicating Singapore, because the Singapore model is not about replication in that sense, because it is about adaptation. So each cities that you're talking about, if you actually went for the Singapore model, would actually be adapting to its own circumstances and consequently going down completely different paths. So if you wanted to blindly replicate and create a Singapore, it would actually violate the Singapore model in the very first place. The whole point about it is, therefore, allowing evolution and playing along with it. Okay? Now the question then arises is that if you're not having a master plan, then how do you manage an evolving city? Is it the case that you have laissez-faire? No. There is a case for intervention, but the kind of interventions that you do is very different. There is, and if you will allow me to elaborate, there are two layers of this. One is that you do need some underlying anchors to the system. For example, you do need a system of enforcement of laws and property rights. Okay? Now that is a meta framework that you need, which is quite different from having a very predetermined master plan. But once you have generated that, you then can use strategic interventions of various kinds. And I will give one example as a way of getting a certain kind of city going. Now when we, for example, in India build universities, one interesting thing that we do is that we have a view of the university as being some sort of a blocked off thing that we have to build, needs 300 acres, build a large wall around it, and it is to be used for education. This is a very industrial view of, or a machine view of what a university is supposed to be. Now you go to universities in most cities in other parts of the world. The university is an integral part of the city. I mean, I went to Oxford University. You couldn't distinguish which bit is Oxford University and which bit is Oxford the city. You go to Boston, I mean, there are universities scattered around the landscape. So when we, for example, if we decide to use universities as a strategic intervention, the way we would do it is to build the new university in the middle of the city, not in a very relatively small piece of land. Why? Because we see the university as bringing young people in as a way of clustering human capital. It is an addition to the city. It is not just about education. And now going back to Singapore, since you started the question with that, do you know that in the last 15 years, Singapore has built a brand new university called Singapore Management University? Now, where did it build that university? It built it in the middle of the city in the most expensive real estate, perhaps in Asia and maybe even some of the most expensive in the world. It's integrated into the city. It doesn't have a walled-off campus. It's built right next to a bunch of museums. It's very close to the financial district. Why? Because this is the university is seen as part of a wider ecosystem to which you are adding. The same thing you can think about when we decided to Formula One racing. The idea, the engineering idea that Indians were obsessed with was that Formula One racing was about trying to get cars to go as fast as possible. So what do? We created a walled-off Formula One circuit out somewhere in the boondocks where, yes, the cars go very fast. What did Singapore do? Singapore said that no, driving the cars is almost peripheral. What it did is about creating buzz in the ecosystem of Singapore. So what did it do? It created the track right in the middle of the city, created a cool place, created rock concerts, and these cars, fluorescent cars, racing around in the night in Singapore. It's one of the best advertisements for Singapore. What would we have done if we should have done it again? Well, we should get them to run on Rajpath at midnight with helicopters beaming it to the world. Come to India and witness. Yeah. So that is why there's a fundamental difference in the ecosystem thinking of urban design, and the master plan Le Corbusier's view of cities as a machine.
You know, Sanjeev, I couldn't have disagreed with you at all on this, because when you say ecosystem, that means we are saying it's an organism which is going to take a life of its own, it's going to grow over a period of time. So having said that, I have a couple of follow-on questions. Like one is, when you touch upon the idea of the university, we create the universities which are outside the cities or whatever.
And wall them.
And wall them. But then if you really look at it, you give an example of SMU, which is one of the most productive universities in the world. And then we have the IIMs.
And in 15 years.
Exactly. And when we have IIMs here, which are not very productive in terms of research, output, or whatever. If I really look at Singapore Management University, 7,500 students. If I talk about one of the finest IIMs, it's just about 1,500 students. So why that issue that emerges? Like, how do we really create that ecosystem?
No, because basically we think about the city as a standalone idea that only does, it's like a factory view. And so now what happens, we build a university in an odd place like Bodh Gaya or Nalanda or some such place. Now what do you want the professor to do? Our idea is the professor gets up in the morning, the wife sits at home and knits and cooks, and the professor goes and teaches. This is a factory town view of what a university will be. So it's a mechanical view. Whereas in fact, one of the reasons we can't get great faculty in some of our IITs and so on is because what does the professor's spouse do? What do his kids do? And so nobody wants to go to these places. Whereas if we had an ecosystem view of the whole thing, there is no problem of finding great faculty in IIT Delhi by comparison to, say, Kharagpur. Why? Because they are a part of a wider ecosystem. And not only that, the city benefits enormously from it as well. What benefit does Kharagpur get from having an IIT there? What benefit does Kanpur get of having an IIT there? Nothing. Whereas, can you imagine Boston without Harvard and MIT? So this is very important, that it is a part of the ecosystem and is kept free and open for it.
Awesome, Sanjeev. But I have to come to you, Sonu, out here, because what Sanjeev is saying is very powerful, that you need to have an ecosystem. And what he's probably also hinting at is that we can actually look at entrepreneurship. We can look at some bit of things happening on ground. And you are actually talking about entrepreneurship. How do you think we can actually evolve that whole idea of entrepreneurship within cities? How we can actually create that prosperity? How do we actually, because everybody's been talking about jobs. Everybody's saying that they're in the morning sessions as well. So where do you see entrepreneurship would actually be the push forward?
So with this specific thing on, how to empower, move it away from, say, public to private. In my experience, I've learned that when you need to empower somebody, you have to give up some power. So it's very well for the government to say we want to empower. So, there's a difference between what we want to, what we say and how we implement it. Empowerment can happen when the government, and government is this large, faceless, nameless set of people, if they are willing to give up power, which is very difficult, and therefore let the entrepreneurs go and do their stuff to build new cities, to build new countries, to build new infrastructure. That's one. And two, stop seeing entrepreneurs as people who are rich, and because they're rich, they're anti-poor. So like one of the earlier speakers said, I think you said that if you are for the government, then you are anti or something like that, right? So the second point that I have is that if you want to promote entrepreneurship, you have to start celebrating. And I spent half my career with the Tatas, and there's one quote of J.R.D. Tata that stays with me. He says, any country that wants to build and enrich its people by pulling down the rich and will never succeed. You have to pull up the poor. And who's going to pull up the poor? It is the entrepreneurs. So for me, the only solution is that somebody needs to give up power to empower the people who will go out and do.
Tamal, I have to follow up with a question here. What she's saying is that it's the corporates which can actually solve the problems that we are actually facing. And you said something very interesting in your talk, in your point of view, that it's going to be some solutions that corporates need to create, and it has to be beyond CSR, and so on and so forth. And that's where you were talking about Bandhan. So do you think that in the real sense, the future is going to be driven by corporates, or is it going to be driven by governments? Or what's going to be the ecosystem like? And what do you think is the future going to be like?
No, I think it's not an either-or situation. It has to be. I mean, the so-called public-private partnership or whatever you call it. So the kind of, we can continue to say our macroeconomic scenario is pretty good, our fiscal deficit is manageable, so on and so forth. But if you see our debt to GDP ratio, the state of banking, and the state of corporates, the NPAs, etc. So you can't expect the government to do everything, because there is where would you get the money from? Even now we are talking about, Sanjeev mentioned about the solution of getting into that instead of creating a bad bank, we have gone the way of actually insolvency code. But I don't know what's going to happen, unfold, because it's a kind of how do you create? I mean, you can address the stock, but how do you prevent from doing such thing, the flow in future? And secondly, the banks will have to take a much deeper haircut. Where would the capital come from? Nobody is talking about it. So I'm not digressing. I'm just saying that where would the money come from? So if you expect the government to do everything, I think you can't have that. But at the same time, can the other part, the corporations, can they deny their duty? But if you think that by amending the Companies Act and making it mandatory to force corporation spend certain percentage of their profit in the so-called CSR activities, is that the solution if you are hinting at? I am afraid I don't think so it's happening. You can get some numbers, but look at the kind of how many trusts have been created, have been registered over a period of time for the last 2 or 3 years, and actual where is the money going from? So it's just, I think it's a bit of a window dressing, telling the keeping the conforming to the Companies Act. I am doing this, but you will find that I am doing it through my cousin, through my aunts, through my grandmother, through my etc., 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 which is, call it round tripping, call it whatever it is. Not every corporate is doing it, but this entire idea of forcing them to spend certain percentage in a CSR activity and afflicting the poor, it's not the kind of solution. And the Bandhan, I said in a slightly different context. What I said is this: if you want to do good to the poor, but in the form of CSR, it will not probably work, because then the value, then they don't. I have because of my association with Bandhan, I have traveled extensively, not all over India, but some parts of India where India's microfinance entities have presence, not Bandhan alone or others. I found that if you get money free, you don't value it much. And secondly, on the other side, if I am a lender, it's not the money alone. I also need to handhold you and help you in capacity building. So it's not that I give you money and it's not like that. I need to give you money, probably what you are looking for, little less than what you need, what you are actually looking for, because you are always inflating and you may end up doing certain other things with that money. So I have to give you the money, and I have to charge you interest rate. I have to be in a legitimate way, not hounding you and forcing you to commit suicide, by make sure that you return the money. And I have also to handhold you in your capacity building and remain with you. Now, if I am a grant based, so today I am giving you money, tomorrow I will not be able to give you money, because the Belgium, the UK and other grants have not come. So I will not be able to do that.
So, Tamal, what you're saying is that you have to build unique business models around what you're doing. And that's going to be the way for the future?
It's not a future, but it will be a part of the ecosystem. Everybody is using the word ecosystem, so I think it could be a part of the ecosystem. It's just one of the building blocks. And I'm seeing millions could be a little exaggeration, but lakhs of women becoming entrepreneurs in a small scale. Somebody who started in 2003-04 with 10,000 rupees, now actually taking money for a couple of lakhs and employing maybe 6-8 people. They are making gloves, they are doing zari work, they are making blouses, they are exporting things. So many things they are doing. So they need the confidence, they need the hand holding, they need a lender to be with you. But our high street bank bankers, they have a lot of constraints both in the private sector, because how do you get the people there? Because these IIM and other people and all, they need their education for the children, they need other social activities for their family, etc. They would not be there in the villages and all. And public sector banks, they have their industry-wide wage, so on and so forth. So somebody who gets a salary in Malabar Hill, his counterpart in Gachurali in interior Maharashtra will be almost getting the same money. Now you can't have that. You need to have a separate kind of business model, which public sector undertakings do not allow you. So then there is a gap, and between these two stools, these people are being uncared for. And only what I did not complete, by only allowing them to have deposits, it's not the end of the story. It's the beginning. They need to have money when they need to have money for their education also, they need to money for consumption, as well as for their consumption in the sense their weddings, etc., as well as their businesses. And also they need to have in the sense money transfer, that's the, and they need to have other financial access to other financial assets also. It's a complete.
So that's interesting. Dr. Jalan, I have to get to you here. In fact, what he's saying is that what needs to be done and so on and so forth. And you seem to be a big fan of what has happened with the new government. You've actually said, like, for the first time in the history, in so many years, in 30 years, that there is a government in position which can make a lot of changes. And so that's happened after 2014. So what do you think they can actually do? Because the biggest criticism for the government, if at all, is that they've been saying a lot of things, but there are very few things that are happening on the ground. So how would you really reflect on this?
No, but I said a few things about it. In the sense that we have a government majority, so it can take measures which is to reduce the role of government at the center in delivery of services, and to hold the people on the ground accountable in terms of performance. For example, that we have districts, we have lok panchayats, we have states, and we have the center. Now, supposing that our task is that a human development index, the government has also announced that they want our rank to be improved, because that has all to do with nutrition, poverty alleviation, that has to do with literacy, that has to do with all of the shelter and so on and so forth. Now the question then is that how do you get it done? So one of the most important rule is that what you do in terms of disbursement and what you do in terms of allocation of funds must be based on actual implementation. Don't simply say that I'm going to build roads, and therefore so much I'm going to give to these countries, these different states, based on how much road has to be built. You reimburse what road can be built.
So what you're effectively saying is that it's the outcome measures which have to be really looked at.
And now the government has started this dashboard business. That's a good move. And the most important thing to remember is that today in India there is no shortage of money. I'm talking about the fact that you have today, if you have savings rate of 30 plus, if you have the kind of technology that we have, to do DBT or whatever we are doing, if we have technology, if we have talent, if we have wages, if we have a government in power, which is the majority, then there is very little that remains in terms of resources. The just question is, how do you use these resources on the ground to actually make it happen? And what happens is the criteria on which you disburse money.
Very interesting. Sandeep, I have to pull you in. You said something on demonetization, and the channel has not been very positive about it, and you made some criticism. And here is Dr. Jalan, who says there is enough and more money available in the system. Where do you see that dissonance, if at all, that exists? And the second question on to you is that if you really look at media, it is severely criticized on the whole idea of manufacturing consent, the whole Noam Chomsky view or whatever. And you've actually became fairly giving diktats. At least there are people within the media, and I fairly detest them. But I can very candidly tell you that they would actually give that this is wrong and this is what it is and you should bomb Pakistan or whatever. And you're actually like the Supreme Court of this country and the last word and the last authority. And you've been privy to that as well. But then the question is that how do you react to this?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, I think the problem is that it's sort of media is today stuck in this binary. You're forced to take a polarizing position, which may not necessarily make sense. The reason it's worked is because I think media, or at least television, is driven, is too TRP obsessed. You're sort of, your entire content imagination is driven by a TRP mechanism, which is fundamentally unscientific. I mean, we've moved to a better mechanism, but it's still 20,000 households that determine what all of India views. I think, so as a country, we need to evolve into something that's slightly more scientific. But I think just to pick on the point that Sanjeev made, and I was just thinking, what would be the cost of doing, if we were to just look at this university model that he talked about, right? If we were to implement something like that, right, the first thing is, what about the cost of doing it? And I'm not talking about the financial cost, but the social cost. I mean, if you were to move IIT Kharagpur out of Kharagpur, imagine it will be seen as, there'll be political parties who will call it anti-Bengal, for lack of anything.
Actually, you misunderstood what I was trying to tell you. The whole point is not to say moving it out of Kharagpur. The problem will be that Kharagpur city and the IIT should have as few walls between each other.
Sure.
That is what I was arguing for. So that the city, the point is, this is not about IIT just happens to be in Kharagpur. This is about Kharagpur, the city, and IIT is being used to upgrade the city. Very different idea.
Yeah, I agree, but I sort of agree with that broad premise. What I'm trying to say is that for you to do something as bold as that, right? How do you, for you to execute the way you spoke about this, what could be the business model? In my view, the government brings policy and a little bit of capital. The private sector brings in large part of capital, and what the media should do actually is bring in influence and narrative. Because I think the government should not be in the business of trying to control the narrative. The media should to some extent, and the media should have absolute freedom to criticize where it needs to criticize. But where I think the problem with the media is it's not going after the right issues. So I think if the government were to do something like this, which adds up to what I would call nation building, then I think the media should support it. I think if there is no harm in, that's the only way we can progress, because India is such a sort of diverse country. It's so hard to get political consensus that I believe the media can play a role without being polarizing, but by adding to nation building, by bringing its own intellectual capital, by trying to bring in its own influence, because we cannot sort of dispute the influence that media as a whole has. The problem is, as long as we get the narrative right, as long as we get the priority set right, and we are in sync with the capital that the private sector brings in, the policy that the government brings in, I think look at a win-win model. That's the only way, in my view, you can bring in disruptive social changes in the country. Otherwise, you will have incremental change. You will take 15 years to move ahead with GST. And no matter how strong the political leadership is, the nature of our democracy is such that there will always be a lot of forces who will want to pull things down. And I think that's my...
So, like Sanjeev, what he's saying is, or what Sandeep is saying is, that media is going to play an extremely strong role in telling people as to whatever it is. And I know you...
So I have a real problem with why should the media be telling us what to think? Fact of the matter is, sure, just like it is dangerous for the government to telling everybody what to think, it is just as dangerous for the bunch of editors to be telling us what to think. So I think one of the good things that has happened is that there is this noisy universe, particularly with the addition of social media, which I think is an absolutely great thing. Yes, the social media is noisy. Yes, there's some abusive troll behavior in there. But the fact is there's enormous diversity of views there. And yes, you may like some editors, you may not like some editors. You are entirely free to switch channels. What scares me much more is this idea that the media should be driving the narrative. Who is the media to drive the narrative? I think it's an extremely dangerous idea. I'd much rather have a huge diversity of views coming from multiple ways. And in fact, I think one of the good things that has happened in the last 20 years is the fact that there are so many different kinds of things. And thank God the media does not have as much influence that it thinks it has, because in the past what was there? Well, of course, bad old days of Doordarshan, the government telling you what to do, but it was only replaced by crony capitalist approach to the whole thing. So the fact of the matter is, it's this opening up that you have, this moving away from a small cabal of editors telling the nation what to think. You are now, you don't like certain person telling you what the nation wants to know, then you can change to another channel which tells you what the Republic wants to know. It's perfectly fine.
So, Sanjeev, that's very interesting. And I was looking at this kind of an opening. What he says is something very similar to what you're actually saying. He's saying that media should just give a point of view. And I think media should keep that role true to itself that they give a point of view, they give the news, and that's where it should be.
But that should be diverse.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I don't disagree with Sanjeev at all.
I think so, yes.
So I think fundamentally I agree with what he was trying to say. All that I'm trying to say is, so, it's not the job of the media to set the narrative. All that's trying to say is that the media needs to add its influence in the right direction. It should question what is right, it should question what is wrong, and use its influence, which it exists, and it's not influence that 10 editors have, influence that a bunch of organizations have, influence that social media has as well. All of that influence should be channelized in one direction. That was the larger point I was trying to make, that if policy comes from the government, I don't think the media should tell the government what it should do or vice versa. It's the government's job to do what it needs to do, the media's job to sort of comment if it's right, wrong, whatever, but where it believes it's right, instead of holding itself back from just reporting on it, I think media needs to look at playing a more constructive role in adding to the narrative. That was the broader point that I was trying to make.
So Tamal, your role as an author and as an editor for one of the newspapers, so what do you think?
I think, many of us or some of us, I think, take us very seriously. Yeah, that's one. And these are all little, I'm being a little cryptic because there's nothing much to add after what is said. So one is this, some of us take us very seriously. And second is, I think you deserve the media you get the media that you deserve. So it is your prerogative to switch on or switch off the channels or drop a paper or not. Because yes, some of the media houses are run by certain corporations, companies now in India. I don't need to get into all the details. Some of the ethics that have been employed, certain media houses are questionable. So all these things are there. But I think at the end of the day, we are a facilitator. The events happen there, and my job is to correct presentation of the event to you people, my readers or my audience. I am a very old school because of probably of my age, and I have 3 decades in media thing and all. So I don't think I should be sitting on the seat of a judgment. From a pulpit, I force you and I don't allow you to have your opinion, and I abuse you if you don't agree with me. I don't belong to that school. So my job is a facilitator. And but other part of it is I think whether it's a government or others and all, I think dissent. We should have the patience to encourage dissent also. That tolerance, I think, also is very critical to build a constructive relationship. And it's a very symbiotic relationship. It's not that either or. No, you don't have media or you have only pro media. Nothing like that. So I think we, the people, and the government, because of governance, I think we need to have also the patience for dissent. So that's very critical. That patience, we find that sometimes it's lacking.
So Sonu, you wanted to add something to this.
I just wanted to add to it. So as a consumer of media, for me the scariest part is not knowing which is news and what is paid news. So in the good old days, there was a differentiation between advertorials and editorial, and
the whole thing was paid news, so it's okay. Sometimes by the public, by somebody else. So it's all right.
Maybe. But today when I read a newspaper, I really don't know whether it is something which somebody is paying to put as editorial news, or is it something that is something that the media themselves have done.
Created.
So investigative journalism, pure reportage and all of that, that is the scary part for me.
So I think Dr. Jalan, I have to ask you a question here. As the senior most person on the panel, who has actually seen, and the most experienced actually, I should say that, and somebody who's actually seen India grow over a period of time. Where do you think the role of media should be? Because I think as a thinker, as a person who's been a doer as well, you've created a lot of impact. And do you think media can actually play a much positive role in how it can actually profess or tell things?
How do you define media? The first issue that you have to say is, are you talking about newspapers, which are daily newspapers? Or are you talking about media in terms of magazines, in terms of...
So if you just say broad...
The whole lot.
Yeah.
The whole lot of it. And that was in social media and Twitters and all this sort of thing. I would say so far as the role of media is concerned, you have to define it in a way. One is that it depends on who is financing them. Supposing that we have media, you watch channels which are government financed. So you would not have any problem in knowing that they are reporting government, or government's view. And then you can have media which is private, but they are looking for TPRs or whatever you call it.
TRPs.
TRPs and so on and so forth, otherwise you will draw advertisement. So everybody is constrained in that respect because of the cost, finance, and so on and so forth. But the only point I want to make to you is that in our country, the fact that the press is free to do what it wants to do, say what it wants to say, and there are editorials, there are comments, and so on in newspapers if you read. So variety of comments, variety of things. So we are fortunate to have the media, which is free, which is fair, and which can report what other people do.
So I think it goes back to a similar point that we should just have diverse sets of or points of view. I think each one of us should stay true to our jobs in terms of like he as a government person, you as a media person, you give your narrative in terms of dissect the whole views and so on and so forth, and they do what they are supposed to do. So that is how it will actually be looked
absolutely.
at.
And I'm very proud of our press. You know, I mean, if you read 6 newspapers, you will get 6 different views. I mean, I don't want to name them, but you have pink newspapers, which are giving you a wide variety of news at the corporate level, at the macro level, at the reporting level, and also editorial level.
Perfect. So I would like to open this floor to the audience. So we have a few questions here. Can we have the question from you, please? So we have time for 2 or 3 questions, and then I have a closing question to all the panel.
I have a question for Sanjeev. My name is Atul Khosla. Sanjeev, great ideas. But my question is, there seems to be a big disconnect between out-of-the-box thinking that policymakers like you have compared to the final sort of in-the-trenches policymakers. I'll give a small example. You spoke about universities. So I run a university in Himachal. Love your idea of having a non-contiguous university, but my statutes say that I need 30 acres of land. So how do you bridge this disconnect? How do you make sure that your out-of-the-box thinking actually gets translated into real changes that happen on the ground?
Beautiful question.
So this is an absolutely critical question, and this is why I'm taking so much effort to go into something which is obscure, which is looking at the meta-narratives and the conceptual backgrounds. Many of the mistakes we are making comes from this problem. You see, this 30-acre thing, after all, didn't exist in the past. Some of the best colleges in India, whether it's LSR, St. Xavier's, Calcutta, Sydenham, etc., are built on 2, 3, 4. I went to one of India's top colleges, which is impossible to get into, Sri Ram College of Commerce. And it's built on much less than 30 acres, maybe 15, 16 acres at most. So the point I'm making is that that wasn't there. So where did it come from? Because you see, this is a part of a meta-narrative of the 1950s, when the meta-narrative shifted to this idea of building a rather ecosystem, a machine. Then you see it fed through to everything. It went into the Mahalanobis planning comes from it, but so does Le Corbusier's cities. So does this idea that 30 acres is needed, because it's coming from an underlying meta-narrative of siloed thinking process, which in turn comes from an idea of thinking of the world as a machine, because in a machine, the small bits add up to the whole. In an ecosystem, they're all mushy, mix and match through each other. Once you shift to a mix and match universe, the way of thinking, then everything changes. The way you run the economy, but also how you design cities, how you think about the university. You don't need 30 acres. Absolutely, why do you need 30 acres? Mix and match it with what you need to do, and you get on with it. So that is why there is a very big, so that is why right in the beginning I said, many of the conclusions we arrive at are not derived from logical reasoning or from empirical observation. It is derived ultimately simply from the intellectual framework you happen to have imbibed. And this is why no amount of arguing on specific cases is going to solve this problem. You have to destroy the intellectual framework. And that is why I'm talking about something so obstruse in economic theory and talking about ecosystems and all of this. Because I want you to understand one of the things that we are attempting to do is to deconstruct that way of thinking and reconstruct the alternative. In 1991, we threw away a particular manifestation of the machine theory, but we didn't throw away the machine itself. Now we are saying, actually, we don't want this machine. We want a different way of doing it. So the underlying construct itself is being changed. And I've just gave you that example. How was GST implemented? Very different. How are we solving the NPA problem? We are not the conventional wisdom till a few months ago was, oh, the main machine didn't work, let's create a bad bank, which is an alternative machine. And instead, I give you how we are going to go about it, which is a much more learning by doing a feedback loop-based system. So there will be, and already is, real changes that will come once you begin to change the meta-narrative. And I'm giving these lectures, by the way, in several important urban design discussions, the same idea, and I will talk about is why do you need 30 acres? After all, how many of our top institutions are built on 30 acres?
So I think what you're saying is self-adaptive systems that have
self-adaptive systems, and self-adaptive system itself, the other idea is that of the meta-narrative of the ecosystem.
Awesome. Yes, sir. Yeah, question for you. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a short remark on a question that came up saying, you know, why is the yawning gap between strategy and it getting implemented and its connection to your construct, Sanjeev? You know, one of the remarks that you made is that for it to actually get implemented, you need to let go, right? So you need an empowered, I would say, I would add to that, an empowered, disaggregated, autonomous, neurally connected system which works. You know. If that is so, just make a last line. If that is so, then you would need to have a government that would empower across 4 layers of union, state, local governance, and people.
Sanjeev.
I agree with you, because learning by doing, obviously, central government cannot be learning and doing, street planning in some small town. So, absolutely. Hence, this whole discussion about, cooperative federalism and so on. So, it is embedded in what is being done. But I just want to even change the language you use to express this idea. You said, planning and strategy and implementation. This itself is a machine way of thinking, because you build a machine by planning and then meticulously designing. No, let me show you. I want you to understand that language itself is wrong, because there is no original plan and implementation separate. There is a broad framework, and then you are making it up as it goes. This is a feedback loop-based system, and you're absolutely right that this has to be disaggregated, because there is no way that it's not humanly possible for the top to understand the requirements on the bottom in this disaggregated system.
Please, sir, I think we just leave it here. You can do the discussion offline.
The reason is I did not talk of a machine.
No, so the disaggregation between a strategy and implementation cannot be. They're the same thing.
Can we cut it here? Yeah. Can I actually, Yatish, can you ask a question? And if this question is to Sanjeev, I'm not going to take it.
Mr. Jalan.
Interesting thought and interesting ideas, and I've been following Sanjeev for some time now on his books and stuff. When you create a new framework and you create a system which is organic in nature and which is supposed to evolve, it is very highly dependent on people and who will run it. Now, the reason a mechanistic world was created and these mental models were created was because they were supposed to de-link it for the people who will run it. So when you say that we'll break this intellectual framework or this mental model and we'll replace it with a new framework which would have organic part, what happens to the kind of people who will actually run it then?
So I'll just go to the next
question. Should I answer it, or?
I'll go to the next question and then come to you.
Question is not to Sanjeev, it's to Sonu. Okay. Sonu, you talked a lot about family business, and you're right, they contribute a lot. But I've been wondering, why is it that very, very, very small part of Indian business looks global or thinks globally, thinks large enough? My thought is that they get satisfied too easily, and they more get bothered with, enjoying the riches earned over the past time rather than building continuously. Or we should have seen a Walmart from India.
Can I break it?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Can I break it into 2 parts? One is to do within the family. They don't grow because of internal family dynamics. The second one is that most businesses start small, and to grow big you need finance. Today when you look at it, who lends to small businesses? Who lends to, say, startups? They cannot go public because they don't make profits. As they grow bigger, SMEs are the most risky segment considered to lend to. When banks lend to larger businesses, they're willing to write off thousands of crores of capital. To grow, you need capital. And if there is access to capital, you can employ better people. Today, if I'm a small store and I want to grow bigger, I don't have the capacity.
No, I understand. Just a small addition to that. Like, you would see too many people trying to build a business and sell it and get out. Say, you had a famous Max. Why not create an Indian telecom company? I'm just not trying to take on somebody. No,
there are two.
I'll differ. There's actually none. If you ask me, they are basically owned elsewhere.
Okay, perfect. I think this becomes an offline question, but I have to really close this. Sanjeev, your point and the people question, very quickly.
Absolutely, good people are needed. The good thing about a disaggregated system is that you're not dependent on a few wise men sitting in planning commission or in finance ministry or an extremely brilliant principal economic advisor tells everybody else how to lead their lives. What you really need is two things. One, you need enforcement of contracts. Therefore, a legal system disaggregated that people have contracts between each other and they do whatever they do and they're empowered by the system, which is why there's a whole business about federalism, disaggregated and contracts at the ground, one. The second thing is, because it's a feedback loop learning by doing system, you have to allow errors to happen, okay? This requires, again, contracts, enforcement, but very importantly, it requires bankruptcy. Because bad ideas have to, like in an organic system, the bad mutations have to be weeded out. And again, notice, this is one of the first things that this government did was bankruptcy law. Why bankruptcy law of all the 500 other things that need to be done? Because this is a feedback loop-based system. You need, when you do a bunch of things, up front, no wise men can tell you which of these ideas is going to work out right. So you have a system by which it knocks out the bad mutations and allows the good ones to flourish. But incidentally, one of the ironies of this is that I'm explaining all of this to you sitting here in 2017, whereas all of this is very much there in a lot of the literature. Hayek, in his Nobel Prize winning lecture, talks about the pretense of knowledge, and he mostly talks about how so-called economic experts pretend to know where the future is going. And much of his discussion is about that. If you read Indian political thought or even mythology, the idea of manthan is a very important concept. Why manthan? Because manthan is throwing up both poisons, vish, and amrit or nectar. And what is the success is dependent on the ability to absorb the vish and letting the nectar flourish.
So perfect. That is why the Thinkers Sandbox Forum. This is exactly the manthan that we are doing. So Tamal on this, like I'll not allow Sanjeev to answer this, but when he says you have the bankruptcy code, and then do you think you should actually go after the rest of people who have gone bankrupt?
Sorry, I couldn't.
You need to go after people who have gone bankrupt. You have people like somebody sitting in London or whatever. So how would you react to that?
No, absolutely. I welcome this bankruptcy code. I think this is one of the very, very critical reform, whatever you call it, in the banking space. So that has happened. But of course, I have certain issues with how the bankruptcy code has been drafted. I think it's a very aggressive code, even by the standard of the developed markets. So if you see, the first case was ICICI Bank filed against somebody in Pune. I'm not getting into all the details. Between then and now, only close to 100 cases have been referred. Have we seen any single case has been cleared so far? No. So I think bankruptcy code is absolutely welcome, but we need to have patience to work. It's pretty aggressive. We don't have the ecosystem. Again, I'm using that to make it effective, right ecosystem in place. And then there are certain issues with the bank. They are scared of CBI, CVC, the so-called 3Cs, CAG, in taking decisions, taking haircuts. So this oversight committee, which we had earlier, 2 gentlemen, now we have even more. But then the bankruptcy code also does not prevent you from going to the proper legal channel. So like one particular company, SR, it went to Gujarat High Court, and the first thing the Gujarat High Court said that RBI has to retract the word called, it would be put on a fast track thing. But ultimately, of course, it has been allowed and gone into NCLT. So I think it will take a while, a few years probably, to create certain precedents. And once those precedents are created, so the people will not be going again to the the normal legal system, judiciary and all. So I think it is absolutely mandatory. It should have been done before, and it's absolutely welcome step.
What do you think, Sandeep? What do you think are the changes that you would like to bring in? Like one is enforcement of contracts, the bankruptcy code, something else from your mind of view which is going to drive us forward. No, what is your wish, or what is your what do you call poison here?
No, wish for the country as a whole, for the economy, I mean, or wish for the media as a whole. Oh, wish. Oh, okay. The wish, the poison, of course. No, so I think we need more collaborative thinking. I think that's something that's the point I was trying to make earlier as well, and then it ended up a little bit of media bashing. But I think what we need is more collaborative thinking. I just think we have an incredible amount of intellectual capital in this country residing in various quarters. It just needs to all come together. We may agree to disagree, we have diverse opinions, but we just need to evolve a broad national consensus on what we want to move forward, because otherwise, I mean, I'm just sort of thinking, how do we move it from beyond thinker sandbox conversations to sort of execution, and what role can each one of us as citizens of this country play, what role can media play, what role can private industry play, and I think we need to move in that direction. So I think that is, in my view, the most critical thing.
Dr. Jalan, your final word, and this is where we'll close the conversation. What do you think?
So my final word is that there is no final word. But I would say just one thing, that what we need are political reforms. That you have to somehow get out of the colonial legacy, get into the India which it is today, rather than what it was in 1946 or 43, and try to get it done through the help of all the people on the ground and in a layer where it can be executed.
Very nice. So I think on this note, I would like to just say that we have to dismantle the Macaulay's idea of whatever India was. We have to really talk about governance in a new way, new sense. Something like what Sanjeev was saying in terms of like start talking about ecosystems, start talking about people, start talking about competencies, and that is where it is. We have to really break that colonial legacy. And we are seeing some stances or stands by the government, this government, the previous government, that there are some things that are happening. So on this note, on this happy note, I would like to call it for the panel. Thanks a lot for joining us.